awakening. But anyway, so the one I chose second, just because of the fun name that it has, okay, nothing fell, is Peter Pillsbury's Pride Parade. And I have literally no idea what to expect in any of these books. So, trigger warning if something happens that may be violent or sexy or whatever. I have literally no idea. Hey, Yasmina! Are you about to sit through some stories with Sister Freida? So, Peter Pillsbury's Pride Parade by J.G. Hayes, from the book This Thing Called Courage. They found out when he was 17 and threw him out of the house. Ooh, this one's going to touch me in my spots. He spent 3 nights out on the street, each evening venturing closer to downtown. He became aware that something was going on a certain block. Cars would slow down, and young men very much like himself, their hands jammed into their pockets, would approach these cars. On his 4th night out, hungry, shivering, an older man picked him up and brought him to the home of Peter O'Sullivan. Let me back that line up. I just screwed that all up. On his 4th night out, hungry, shivering, an older man picked him up and brought him to a home that Peter O'Sullivan, I suppose our narrator, our protagonist, had never seen the likes of before. He didn't realize at first that the man's kindness was based on Peter's youth and looks, his baseball-trained body. Peter was overwhelmed by the man's kindness, though he never told him so, and he had no problem repaying the man in the way that the man liked. During his 4th month of living with the man, Peter overheard him on the phone in the next room. Peter had been napping. "Oh, just a little Mick, nothing from Southie," the man was saying to a friend. "Well, darling, you haven't met him for the simple reason that he's too embarrassing to take anywhere. My God, his English is so bad that I could hardly understand him myself. But hotter than nothing you ever saw before." Peter sat up in bed. The clock said it was 11:12 p.m. The man was laughing now, that snickery laugh. Peter had been devastated, but not shocked at his family's abandonment. He hadn't expected the man's generosity in a world that thus far had only showed him isolation and judgment, and the man's kindness had revolutionized the way that Peter looked at things, at life. He now realized how wrong he'd been. He felt something inside him closing down. He saw now that he was no more known, no more important to the man than the abusin carpet that lay between him and the bed, the armoire that had been made custom in Providence, and the house that guests stole into bedroom after bedroom to stare at and touch with fingered rings. Peter got out of bed, dressed, and slipped out the back door. "No one will ever laugh at me again," he said. Boom, boom, boom. 10 years later. At the edge of the continent was a city. At the edge of the city was the ocean, and the sun lifted itself from this ocean and stabbed light into the city. It was a June morning. The sky gleamed cobalt. The world seemed flawless, which was only right because it was Gay Pride Day. In one section of the city, wisecracking civil servants ran yellow crowd control tape along the edges of the sidewalks. Street vendors hawking everything from rainbow condoms to hot dogs secured strategic corners. Police began arriving, establishing either a comic or resigned blue presence. More passerby than usual were out for an early Saturday morning. Some idled about gawking. Others moved quickly in and out of the morning shadows. One of these latter, his step full of purpose, emerged from an ancient brick building still sleeping in darkness. Once a piano factory, then for decades a squalid rooming house, the building was now used predominantly as a male gym with a 2-month waiting list if you didn't know someone. Peter Pillsbury crossed the street and stepped into the sunlight, revealing a black nylon running suit with white stripes down the side, dark hair that came no lighter in the sun. He smiled back at the threesome sipping lattes at a neighborhood cafe, one of whom had knocked at the window and waved to him, hoping for an audience. But Peter had no time on this day of days for idle chatter. Besides, conversation was an investment for Peter, and he always chose his investments carefully. The tolling of the old church bells fell upon him 5 minutes later as he inserted 3 different keys into 3 different locks at the front door of his building. At first, he took this tolling, somber as it may have been, as a good omen, until the 10th gong fell upon his ears with a distinctly sour note. 10? 10 o'clock? He lifted his wrist as he passed his building's hallway, but was greeted only by the tanned flesh straddling a fish-belly white ribbon. He remembered that this designer watch was encoased in the designer's canvas gym bag that was slung over his shoulder. Turning, he caught a glimpse of the church's tower that stood at his front door behind him. He shook his fist at it in panic and in anger, but not without a single pleasure as he pumped the state of his bare forearm, a pleasure that mingled with, but did not overcome, his sudden franticness. 10 o'clock! The old church tower must be wrong, yet he'd never known it to be wrong in the 5 years that he'd been living across from it. He was glad now in his anger, as if the church tower clock was a master of time and not simply its messenger. That the church had been defrocked, desanctified, and compartmentalized 4 years ago into that fashionable condominium building, but he would have been glad anyway. He remembered 5 years ago, his first year in this condo, when the church was still serving its original purpose, and he could see decrepit persons tottering to and from the building on a Sunday morning. Hardly people that added anything to their up-and-coming neighborhood. An old building was something else that could be rehabbed, but Peter had little use for old people. And now designer fabrics, techno-industrial furnishings, and scintillating conversation had replaced those hushed mutterings of bead-telling fools and their cane-wielding, echoing footsteps. Peter had been to every party that mattered in the church condos since its opening 3 years ago, and couldn't imagine life without the California Cool Cafe on the ground floor, with its retro barbershop chairs and gothic, pornish watrons. Watrons, I suppose this is a gender-neutral term for waiters, waitress. I did not know. But 10 o'clock, shit! That left him 1 hour. To get himself ready for the Pride Parade. He flew up the hall stairs 2 at a time, feeling the pleasant pump in his just-worked hamstrings. He could almost see, in fact, could tell in his mind's eye the smooth, muscle-swollen calves as well. But in that same perfectly arranged chamber, he could also see the stubbing hair on those calves and hamstrings that would have to be shaved. Oh, it couldn't be 10. 2 more keys fumbled into 2 more locks, and Peter Pillsbury burst into the clean, exact space that he called home. The metal postmodern clock was staring him in the face. 10 o'clock. He felt the color rise into his already flushed cheeks, and for an instant he was swept with panic, the same panic of the fire-stricken, who have only seconds to prioritize what objects will you grab in the mad dash for safety. Damn those New Yorkers, Peter said aloud. He dumped the canvas gym bag onto his Italian white leather sofa. The two out-of-towners at Peter's gym this morning had been two of the hottest guys that Peter had seen in ages, so of course he had to talk to them, be seen talking to them, to consume them, as it were. They had shuttled in last night for the Pride Parade today, and like Peter, they'd been getting one last workout in before the high noon kickoff. But now he could see that he had lavished too much time on them. After all, they'd only be spectators' faces in a crowd, while he, Peter, would be on a float. And not just any float, the float. Damn them, and damn that church tower. But at least he had determined by his conversation with them that they weren't quite as hot, quite as handsome as he himself was. To calm himself before plunging into the chaos that must now be inevitably following, he closed his eyes and saw their flaws again. Both tall, both built, one brunette, the other a blonde, with all the right words spilling through their bleached, flawless smiles. Nevertheless, all of this could not hide the crow's feet on one of them and the weak chin on the other. True, they were just barely visible, these flaws, and Peter had to search to find them, but they were flaws nonetheless. The thought of them now spread joy through Peter like, well, crow's feet. For other than the occasional blemish, Peter knew that he himself was flawless, as did many others using the same criteria. He smiled. It was always L.A. this and South Beach that, but it had been Peter's delight to show these big applers that Boston wasn't a dreary little backwater, and it sometimes was dissed as. It was an A-list compared with any of the cities, and Peter was about as high on the gay city's A-list as one could get. If he were now running late because he had to prove a point, well, maybe it was worth it after all. He opened his eyes and saw his face reflected back at him in one of the 11 mirrors strategically placed about his condo, and he liked what he saw. Yes, he was hotter than they were, and yes, it had all been worth it, well worth it, worth more, in fact. He recalled with a smirk what Brad Kent, a definite wannabe, had said behind Peter's back 2 years ago, that you couldn't stand anywhere within Peter's 2,000-foot square condo and be out of view of a mirror. Well, Peter remembered quipping at the time, if the same can't be said for Brad's place, then maybe there's a good reason for that. That retort had henceforth become known as the comment, and it had cast Brad from the approaching glow of A-list perhapness and back into some lesser, darker place from whence he had crawled. Not that Brad was ugly, actually he was quite handsome as long as the light was right. But only 1 year older than Peter, Brad looked 10. He was aging like cheese, Peter thought. It didn't occur to Peter that he should feel anything other than delight in this. And what trip down memory lane would be complete without visiting the night? The night of his housewarming was a night that people were still talking about 3 years later. All of gay Boston was there, as well as just the right amount of hotties from L.A., New York, and South Beach. The hottest DJ du jour had been hired. Peter couldn't remember his name now. And then he had shown up. The man who had taken Peter off the streets years earlier. Of course 2 of Peter's friends were working the front door, making sure that the unattractive, unknown, and unimportant didn't get in, and Peter had given a slight shaking of his head when the man showed up, friends in tow. "But I know Peter," the man blustered, his fat face reddening and a snarl puckering his face. "Sorry," Peter's friend had said, smiling blandly as other young and more attractive people streamed in. "We only have room for so many, you know." There was a God, for someone had at that moment asked, "Who's that?" and Peter, answering loud enough for the departing man to hear, "Oh, just a fat old nothing that I used to know." But enough. Now to action. Peter flew into his bedroom and stripped off the designer running suit and black jock strap beneath. Ah, he thought, flexing in the mahogany cheval mirror, this morning's 2-hour workout was just the ticket, gilding the lily of his masculinity with a fresh pump. He thought again of an ad he had seen some years ago in which some fat smelly zine at the gym. That ad that had summed up his life as Peter saw it. The ad was too successful, at least for Peter, in that he'd forgotten the product that it was shilling. But there had been an exquisite blue, black, and white butterfly, wings spread in its full glory, antennae richly crenulated, sitting on a twig beside a tiny, rather ugly, common moth, the color of crinkled parchment, and the copy read, "Either you have it, or you don't." Precisely. It had been an epiphanic moment for Peter. These have very big words right next to each other. It had been an epiphanic moment for Peter. Irreligious, not so much from a dogmatic point of view, but more as a matter of scheduling. Irreligious. I hate when I get stuck on a word like that. Point of view as a matter of scheduling. In his better moments, Peter would feel a warm gratitude pulse through him toward whatever deities he had now deemed that he liked and that he didn't. He examined himself minutely, front, back, sides. He'd been highly disturbed to read on the internet some months ago that the human body contained an excess of 420 muscles. Previous to this, it had been enough to work chest, shoulders, and arms one day, his back, legs, and abs the next, and cardio every day of the week. But since this revelation, he had had trouble remembering a recurring nightmare in which all 40 muscles had to be worked separately, exhaustingly, and he would awaken from such nocturnal terrors, drenched, feeling some oppressive, overwhelming weight upon him, crushing out whatever joy may still exist within him. Peter would employ at times like these the same game he used to put himself to sleep with a hectic schedule, or too much of the drug du jour would render him sleepless. This game involved ranking the myriad of people he knew based on a number of criteria. Obvious things, of course, like appearance, musculature, leanness, fat-to-muscle ratio, the straightness and whiteness of their teeth, eye color, fashion sense, bone structure, hair, skin, and nails, but also equally vital considerations such as their address, wealth, occupation, intelligence, and social circle. There were perhaps 50 people that he would rate this way, and numbers 2 through 50 would often exchange places from time to time if there were a mad, exhausting dance going on inside Peter's head. But numbers 1 and 50 were invariably the same. Peter in the former, and someone that Peter now referred to as Fatty always in the latter position. But sometimes even this calming practice would produce a nightmare of its own, in which everything went topsy-turvy, and those on the bottom of the list had swung up to occupy the top positions, and vice versa. In these dreams he himself would be standing in front of a mirror, exhaustively aware of a 1,000-item regime that he would have to get through to make himself presentable. And no matter what he did, there was always someone inherently, profoundly ugly staring back at him in the mirror. These were the worst dreams of all, repudiating as they did Peter believed in as they did everything that Peter believed in, and at such times he would call out, sometimes in his dream, and sometimes audibly. Myriad of bed partners have confirmed this. Help me, please help me. But on a day such as this, Peter Pillsbury, see, he had changed his name some years ago to something less ethnic, but did not belong to the dreaming class of men. Some minutes later, he reluctantly dragged himself out of the mirror reverie in which he stood with two Peter Pillsburys, as if the manipulance of nature could be imposed upon, and stepped into a multi-directional shower, carrying him with a hot, small, plastic bag of sundries. The chest was the first to be shaved. This was easy, and Peter marveled at how rounded and defined his pectorals were, like fine hills in a Hopper painting. Then, oh, so carefully the legs. A nick here would be most inconvenient on days of days. 15 minutes later, done, and not a scratch. Next, it was time for, in this exact order, an exfoliating mask, a deep cleanser, the pore filler, the clarifier, the moisturizer, and the sunscreen. Now it was the hair's turn. Giorgio's cut 2 days ago had been the best yet, and it ought to have been for the $125 that he paid for it. But talk about money well spent. High and tight on the sides, razor trimmed in the back, the soft, dark locks spilling with seeming abandon into an unlined forehead, a perfect foil for those killer sea green eyes. The hot oil treatment came first, then a thorough rinse before the highlighting chamomile shampoo, which was followed inevitably by nights followed by the super conditioning after rinse with ginseng and evening primrose oil. He was toweling off and about to pluck an errant eyebrow from the bridge of his nose when the buzzer rang. Peter watched himself make a purposely bemused face in the mirror, thought for a moment of what an incredible actor that he would have made, and wondered who. Everyone he knew was doing at this precise moment exactly what he was. They were getting ready for the big event. I won't answer it, he mumbled. The buzzer persisted. Louder, longer, louder. He pulled on his white terry designer robe and padded out to the hall. He watched himself push the intercom button with a freshly manicured nail. Yes, he said rather than asking. Hey, Peter, it's me. It's just me, Ken from downstairs. Oh, God, of all people. Fatty. Yes. Peter didn't bother hiding the annoyance in his voice. He supposed it was a free country, but why the condo association had ever let anyone so fat, so sloppy, so unattractive buy into this building was beyond him, and especially directly downstairs. I heard you upstairs, so I figured that I'd come on and see if you were home, and I'd be right up. Before Peter could tell him he was busy, don't bother, he could hear his neighbor's fast Duprius plodding up the stairs. Peter stomped to the door and flung it open, catching the surprised Ken in the act of picking his nose. The perpetually pimpled red face blushed even deeper. Oh, hi, Ken, sorry. Hi, sorry, Ken stammered. He grasped the railing and tried to catch his breath. I'm kind of busy, Peter snapped, already closing the door on his visual pollutant. Oh, wait, I just wanted to show you. I took your advice and I bought this dark something to hide my weight. Advice? Peter echoed, more to himself. His annoyance grew as Ken undertook an awkward pirouette, bumping into the just-polished banister. He grasped it to catch his balance, and Peter hoped that Fatty's plump fingers weren't sticky with chocolate. Peter would no doubt be bringing someone home later, and people noticed such things. Peter always did. You mentioned once that I might not look so big if I wore darker clothes, Ken explained lowly. He made eye contact at last. His eyes grew radiant. Peter couldn't see this. He was thinking that Ken looked like a burnt, overstuffed sausage in the ill-fitting, already sweaty black shirt and these blacker chinos. "I bought them this morning," Ken fumbled up. "I read that Pride Parade was happening today, and I saw it in the paper last night, and I thought, maybe I should go." Last night? My God, Peter thought, some people are pathetic. He himself had been preparing for this weekend for a year now. "Oh, yeah, great, Ken," as Peter said, closing the door, but Ken lurched forward, alarm in his face. "Wait, I was wondering maybe if I could walk up there with you. I mean, to the parade, Ken gulped audibly. There, he said it. It wasn't as flowery as he had seen it in his head last night, practicing the words over and over again, but he got them out, and that's the main thing. Ken wasn't kidding himself that this would be any kind of date. Surely his upstairs neighbor could have been just any man that he wanted. It was just a friend thing, someone to go to Pride with. Surely no one would exclude him on this day when the community celebrated its solidarity, its survival. Peter's face registered shock. Where did people get the nerve to think that someone like he, Peter Pillsbury, would be interested in even casually conversing with someone like Ken, let alone be caught dead walking the streets with him, and on Pride Day? "I need to be there early, 11 a.m., he said, beginning to shut the door again. "I can go early, I'm already ready," Ken exclaimed. But he said the words to Peter's closed door. Ken thought at first that Peter would return, that he'd only gone for a moment, maybe to get something, but a full minute went by, then two, nothing. "What an asshole," Ken mumbled. As he turned to descend the stairs, he heard the phone ring inside Peter's apartment. Ken heard a familiar, worshipful tread of Peter's bare feet as they flew out of the bathroom. "Hello," Ken heard, muffled, but he still heard, as he always heard, the sound of the voice that thrilled him. No, he shouldn't listen. That wouldn't be right. But he loved that voice, and heard it so infrequently. Besides, what else did he have to do today, now that he wouldn't be going to the parade? For he wasn't going to go alone. He'd reached some critical mass where he just couldn't do one more thing utterly by himself. And try he had. Ken had met a few gay people in the city other than Peter since moving in a year ago. It wasn't for a lack of trying. He'd done the clubs, the restaurants, the bars, walked the streets. But he felt more and more invisible. People's eyes would kind of glaze over and shift away as he approached, as if he were a leper almost. "Oh, God, I'm incredibly late. I got to talking to these two really hot guys from New York at the gym this morning who were cruising me big time," Ken heard. He forgot who he was, and a vision was for at this moment of attractiveness, of making new best friends wherever he went, of numbers exchanged and received, of laughs and thrills and parties, and a phone that would never stop ringing. It was a vision that couldn't have been more unlike his own life. Ken could not allow this, but for the moment his face softened, his eyes growing tender and evocative, as they thought they might have been, as they always might have been, had his life been something much different than it was. A stranger seeing the face might have pronounced it angelic in its wistfulness. And then, as if I wasn't late enough, Ken heard through the door. And that world that had been his for just a moment was snatched back to Peter Pillsbury. "Who rings my buzzer but Fatty from downstairs? Can you believe it?" Ken visibly jolted outside the door. Fatty? But there was more. "Oh, gross! Like a burnt overstuffed sausage." Peter liked this phrase. He thought it was clever. "Oh, who knows? He must have been hallucinating or something. He thought he looked thinner. He kept insisting that I advised him to go out and get dark clothes. I know, as if I could care less about anything he said or did or thought. Oh, but wait, that's not the half of it. He asked me if we could go to Pride together. Hello? I mean, what are these people thinking? Like I'd be caught dead. And he was picking his nose, too, if you can believe it. What a loser. My God, fat, ugly, probably has a little dick, too. Talk about a faggot triple disaster. Cologne? No. Definitely doesn't wear it, and not any tonight. I haven't decided yet. Oh, you did? Oh my God, where'd you see that tired old thing? The voice blurred into babble as Ken, more quietly than he had ascended, moved back downstairs. He gripped the railing tightly, looked neither left nor right. For the second time in 5 minutes, things seemed misty, but this time there was nothing of fantasy about Ken's vision. A faggot triple disaster. That's what they'd called him, a faggot triple disaster. They were right, of course. Ken saw this now. Better he joined a gym than volunteered at the local hospice. Better he had invested his money into a dermatologist's care and spend it on the flower garden that he'd made down the street in the abandoned lot. Better he learned cutting, witty put-downs so that he would be popular, albeit in a vicious, freakish way, rather than spend all his time dreaming of friends that would never materialize. He saw this all very clearly now. He closed his apartment door behind him. He found the chocolate bars that he'd been denying himself all morning on the top of the refrigerator, slightly mushy from the day's warmth. He carried them into his bedroom, and he sat on his unmade bed, his eyes still vacant. He pushed the bars abstractedly into his mouth. He realized he, in his search for community, having moved here, had never felt more profoundly alone. Not even back in 10th grade when the whole world had somehow found out about him, and the beatings and the harassment were doubled, as he found to be no longer just fat, but a fat faggot. His eyes cleared, thanks to the sound of the very hottest and latest dance CD thumping from Peter's stereo just above. He looked across his bed and found Freddie, his fattest and favorite teddy bear. He clutched Freddie to his chest with one hand, and then with the other received a plastic shopping bag from his new, darker clothing that he had carried home with his hopeful self this morning. He slid it over his head, and then pulled the strings so tightly that they cut into the soft of his neck flesh. Then he pulled Freddie into himself with both hands, staring into the bear's dark glass eyes, bottomless with understanding. When he fell forward to the ground, 3 minutes later, his face blue, and a broken blood vessel now in his inactive brain, his neighbor above heard nothing. The thud had occurred in perfect synchronicity with a bass thump on the latest and hottest CD falling like a hammer at that exact moment. In the bedroom directly above where the music originated, Peter Pillsbury had practiced a few dance moves in his full-length mirror, something new he had seen only a week ago down at South Beach. In the corner of his room, a shaft of sunlight gathered, and the mirror's reflection had seemed to be growing. Annoyed at this distraction which was taking him away from matters of conscience, Peter spun around and found the pillar of light, brighter than just the sun, assembling in the back corner of the bedroom. The light seemed to be fluid. It moved like water, but in the midst of a growing mass were individual specks of even brighter light, so bright that Peter found himself squinting. And then a figure took shape within that light. The figure of a woman dressed in blue and white, her face timeless, full of light, yet full of woe. Peter unconsciously backed up. The cheval mirror crashed to the floor behind him. He fell backwards, landing on the floor. The woman seemed to tower above him. Peter tried to scream, but found his tongue cloven to the roof of his mouth. He could feel his heart laboring as if under a tremendous strain. He frantically tried to recall, had he taken X yet? They were planning to at Pride, but the woman opened her arms to Peter. A flood of ferocious light came at him like a train, and he was struck by it. "We have heard your calls for help," Peter heard inside his mind. "Therefore, a gift we bring to you." The last thing Peter remembered was this feeling of passing out, drowning, in a sea of light. He awoke sore and totally unconnected, as if from birth, and then, in a panic, he thought of the time. It was 10:45. He was due at Robert's condo across the street now. All Pride participants had to be at the kickoff point at 11 a.m., and then he saw the mirror, its curved legs unnaturally askew, its shards sprinkling the abusan carpet. His mouth fell open, and he almost wrenched his neck, turning his head to the corner of his bedroom where only moments before, what? A quiet shaft of sunlight was there? As it always was this time of day? "What a dream," he said out loud. Standing up, he quickly cleaned up the mess. It would never do to bring someone home into his condo with this mess. He stood in the bathroom mirror for one last look. He zoned in immediately on his eyes. Something in his very foundations seemed shaken. His eyes looked different, larger, deeper. He remembered something vaguely, then literally shook off the feeling. When he emerged from his shadowed apartment building moments later, Peter felt a chill immediately. He considered for just 1 second changing into something more substantial than the tight black short shorts and this white mesh tank top that he had selected months ago for this day of days, complemented by this slouching snow-white socks and gleaming black construction boots, unsullied by anything even remotely approaching work. Peter had desired to be particularly quiet coming down the stairs, lest Fatty hear him and once more make some nauseating suggestions. But unfortunately, Peter seemed suddenly full of a clumsy something, and he bumped into his brass coat rack at the top of the landing. It clattered down the stairwell with enough noise to, wake the dead. But at any rate, it did not bring Fatty to the hall. Peter crossed the street and ascended the steps of his friend Robert's condominium, the ancient church. Peter buzzed Robert's number, then stepped back to check his polished glass and the double doors, and he saw nothing to dismay him. But when the door swung open, moments later expelling Peter's friend Robert Burrows, a chill breeze blew out like a breath from an old building, a breath that seemed to go right for Peter. It tossed Peter's hair quite out of place, despite layers of the spritz that he had placed on it moments before. "Hi," Robert smiled. "Shit," Peter hissed, and Robert visibly cowered, as if he thought the expletive was directed at him for some fashion faux pas that he had committed in his dress. "What?" Robert gasped, frozen. Peter didn't answer. He was busy arranging his hair in the glass, but somehow he couldn't make it right, damn it. It had been perfect, and it usually was only moments ago. "I need your bathroom," Peter announced. "Wait here and give me your keys." Robert complied instantly, extracting a rainbow keyring from his own slouching snow-white socks. Peter pushed through the door and passed into the building's lobby, the only part of the interior that retained the look and feel of a church and its original purpose. "It's like a tomb in here," Peter commented out loud. He had said the words lowly, or so he thought, but they seemed to echo loudly through the stone chamber. Robert's bathroom was a disgrace, but it had a mirror and hairspray, so it served Peter's purpose. In 5 minutes, Peter was back outside. He and Robert wordlessly began the 4-block trek to the parade's kickoff point, but every reflective purpose storefront that they had passed showed Peter a deteriorating mess. Where once the winsome locks had been, his hair had caught out of place a third time. "Nice ears," Peter exploded. Robert was an almost hypnotypically beautiful man facially. He wouldn't have been Peter's friend if he were any less beautiful. But the classically chiseled face was somewhat lampooned by those jug ears that vented out almost perpendicularly. It was Robert's own visible flaw. Intensely self-conscious about his ears, he colored immediately at Peter's retort, especially in the ears. The day, despite the sun, seemed to grow decidedly chillier. Peter remained silent as a stone as he strove to unravel the Gordian knot that was now vexing his brain. Why had his hair continued to blow in the fucking east wind when he had lacquered it twice to the point of perfection? He held his head stiffly to one side so that the wind would blow with rather than against his hair. But just at that moment the wind shifted, and the locks became all awry again. He turned his head to the other side, and the wind paused and shifted back again. 2 or 3 people in a crowd of passerbys were people that Peter should have stopped and talked to. Their stars were rising in their rehabbing neighborhood, but his angry discomfiture had barely nodded at them, plodding by with silence as Robert was walking by their side. In fact, he heard one of them say to their companion, "What's her problem?" after they passed by. By the time Peter and Robert reached the parade's kickoff point, a chaotic scene of costume, cacophony, and caricature, Peter was livid. Everyone else selected by Peter to be on their float, there would be 12 of them in all, including Peter and Robert, was already milling about. A simple flatbed truck, draped in black cloth with 2 immense stereo speakers attached at the back, had been fitted with a dozen circular platforms of varying height, one for each participant, while the other floats in the parade represented fraternal organizations, charities, or specific clubs. Peter's float represented, as the silver and black banners attached to the truck would suggest, the pride of our neighborhood. Peter was slightly mollified to see that his fellow float participants had followed orders as to their dress. Black boots, white slouchy socks, black shorts, and a mesh tank top of varying color so that the conglomerate effect would suggest a rainbow. But everyone knew that the tank top would be coming off, and sooner rather than later, to unveil the results of their vast amounts of gym time invested and fat askewed. Already 4 of the brethren were shirtless. A small crowd of camp followers had already gathered at the rear of the float. Peter had hoped their numbers would swell into the hundreds as the fast-approaching kickoff time drew near. Peter yelled to the float's driver. He had come as part of the package deal to turn on the stereo system. The driver had been given several tapes the night before, tapes that Peter had personally commissioned from a disc jockey that he knew. Nothing but the latest and hottest music, and the more Euro and obscure the mixes, the better. The music kicked in with a heart-pounding bass intro. An electric jolt raced through the crowd. People began streaming to their float. Peter and his cohorts mounted their assigned platforms. Peter's was slightly higher than the others, and dead center, and it began moving with the music. Tank tops flew off. Peter heard the shrill, microphoned intonations of some charity queens kicking off the parade a block away, and then a deafening siren went off. Thousands of pink and white balloons let loose, and the opal sky became lost for a moment. A mighty roar went up from the crowd. The truck's engine growled to life. The truck began lurching forward. It was about the 7th or 8th in the parade, and Peter turned in time with the music to scan the back of the float. As he had hoped, dozens of men were now trailing the float, arms waving in time with the music, or perhaps in adulation, eyes filling with greasy swipe of lust, adoration, and envy. Just what Peter wanted. He undertook a thicker dance and a trickier dance in response to this attention, the one that he had seen on the dance floors at South Beach. He closed his eyes and let this vox populi wash over him like a love blush. Individually, each member of the crowd was, most of them, clueless, a flabby herd lacking in sense of what really was important in life. But collectively, they were a different thing. When one couldn't see each oily pore, the very cut of their sweaty shorts, collectively he loved them. Loved the fact that they were looking at him, and not just looking at him, but wanting to be him. Just then, the woman of light came back to him, an intrusion he didn't want or appreciate. "Therefore, a gift we bring to you," he heard again. Then an earthly voice cut into his reverie. "You've changed your hair." Turning, not that he had to identify the speaker, he saw the slightest of smiles on the fleshy lips of the dancer just to his right. Geoffrey Trowbridge, the second member of the unofficial Tremulative, and commanded their neighborhood society. Peter himself, and Scott Brenton, another dancer on the float, being numbers 1 and 3 respectively. Geoffrey looked as shiningly flawless as Peter had 1 hour ago. In fact, he looked better than Peter had seen him look before, ever. Bitch. A tang of intense dislike jabbed through Peter. "What horrible timing for a bad hair day," Geoffrey gushed, full of mock sympathy. Hearing no retort, he just smelled blood and continued. "Do you need a ball cap? I can get you one." Among their set, ball caps were the last refuge for the follically challenged, tactful veils for haircuts gone gravely awry, or the tappings of the bridge and tunnel sets. Hold on, my dog wants that. Bridge and tunnel sets, subterraneans who knew no better. "No, thanks," Peter said, putting on his wrap around his shades, trying to look cool somehow. "Oh, Geoffrey," he continued, "I saw Thomas at the gym this morning with this gorgeous guy. I thought you'd want to know." Thomas was the unpredictably artist type who had unceremoniously dumped Geoffrey a week ago, a humiliating first that Geoffrey had vehemently denied. But people were talking, and Peter always listened when they did. Geoffrey snapped back around, his face flaming. This business finished. Peter turned back to matters on hand. The crowd was swelling. The float turned a corner. Crowds stretched to the overflowing side. A roar like a tidal wave went up from the masses. The dancers increased their ferocity, each one taking up time to determine how many adoring throng were looking precisely at them alone. Many at the corner abandoned their coveted front row stations and fell into this mad, swollen troop behind the float. Something close excuse me, something close to what Peter thought would be the short-term reward for all this tugged at him. But then an especially blowsy gust found his hair and wreaked additional havoc upon it. He would have screamed if this weren't in public. He turned to see if any of the other dancers were suffering the same ill effects. Immediately his eyes went to the adjacent Geoffrey, in particular to a quite large, angry red blemish on Geoffrey's otherwise porcelain skin, right in the midst of his calf. No, actually, it was more like a boil, a $50 sized one at least. Having been so preoccupied with the parade's outset and his own hair issue, Peter failed to take a closer look, a critical look at his fellow dancers beyond their outfits. It was for these things that Peter had prepared 2 or 3 alternate dancers, should there be some kind of last-minute unpleasantness like this. Damn, he wished he'd seen it before. Geoffrey would have never been allowed on the float. "Don't look now, Jeff," Peter shouted, using the shorter form of his friend's name, which Geoffrey loathed. "But you're sprouting a third eye on your right calf." Geoffrey stopped dancing mid-beat, as if Peter had said a poisonous serpent were crawling up his leg. Geoffrey turned, and Peter gasped. At least a dozen of these appalling eruptions were sprouting up all over Geoffrey's arm and chest, like a chain of suddenly active volcanoes. Geoffrey's instant cessation of movement drew a few looks from the crowd, some of them visibly startled. "Put your shirt back on! Put it on!" Peter hissed, not in a sympathetic but an embarrassment of association. Geoffrey grabbed his red mesh tank top from his waistband, where it had been waving with his every movement, and swiftly put it on, but it did nothing to hide the boils on his arms. The wind blew again. Peter screamed out loud. This was becoming a disaster. He jumped off his pedestal. Leaning over the edge of the truck, he grabbed the first hat that he saw that wasn't too offensive, a plain black cap, and pulled it on tightly, saying nothing to the man that he liberated it from. A seize of entitlement similar to eminent domain landed seizure, distancing any second thoughts. He turned back to Geoffrey. "You've got to get off!" Peter screamed, almost gagging at the sight of these boils, which seemed to be developing pea-green pus heads now, even as he watched. They were on Geoffrey's face now as well. "Don't look at me like that," Geoffrey screamed back, almost writhing. "Plus, you've got them too, asshole!" Peter looked down. A roaring that was not the crowd flooded his ears. He saw a dozen similar marks coursing across his own chest, along his arms, up and down his now shaved legs. With hands almost frozen to inaction, he donned his own tank top, a horrible thought occurring to him. His hands rested lightly across his heretofore flawless face, and he felt at least 5 or 6 of these boils on his cheek alone. "Oh, they've gone psychedelic with polka dots," a huge drag queen in the crowd shouted, pointing an endless dinner-gloved arm at the Pillsbury float, whose dance had become an almost catatonic shuffle, and not at all what the boys in South Beach were doing. Thus, He was not surprised when turning around he saw similar marks on each of the other dancers, who were now just beginning to notice. Their dance became a grotesque tottering, oddly in perfect time to the music that was now pouring through the speakers like rotten, rank water that Peter had never heard before. Perhaps it was due to his state of mind that Peter didn't even notice exactly when the music changed, but it had. And how did he not know? Instead of the latest and hottest dance mixes, there was almost a funeral dirge, some fantastically horrible wail. He was about to pound on the plexiglass window directly behind the driver when in an instant, and fierce itching exploded halfway inside his right nostril. If there were a power on this earth to resist such an itch, it was not within Peter Pillsbury. In desperation, he drove his newly manicured right index finger as far into the offending orifice as it would go. Everything in his mind, everything he was, rebelled at this action, and he ordered his finger to stop, especially as they were fast approaching the most fashionable, truly exclusive part of their gay neighborhood. But in answer to his left index finger, now joined in the hunt for a sympathetic itching, had now just erupted in the left nostril, he could see peripherally that other dancers were similarly engaged. But what tore at his attention now, above and beyond this uncanny itch, was a growing distrust for his own eyes, for surely Geoffrey, surely David and Michael and Brad, surely all of them were in better shape than this. He knew they were. And what then were these suddenly slouching bellies, these triceps gone loose and flabby, the saggy breast that had once been firm mounds of muscle only minutes ago? A horrible thought occurring to him, Peter drove his eyes downward, and for the first time in his life he could not see his waist, which had become a doughy mass of jellied flesh. Whether it was the morbid, discordant cry pouring from the techno speaker, or the sight of themselves, Peter could not determine, but an opened mouth. Silence now gripped the crowd as the float passed by, a silence that was horrifically surreal because of the number of thousands gathered to watch. Peter would have thought himself gone deaf had it not been for the music. He tried to scream, but nothing would come from his throat but an animal-like guttural groan of dissatisfaction as he continued to scratch away at his inflamed nostrils. A sudden gust of wind tore at his hat, blowing it back into the crowd, and whence therefore it had come, he found he could not move, except for his fully engaged fingers. He had to get off. Fat, riddled with scar-like boils, both hands engaged in the picking of his nose. He had to get home. He had to get out of view. Had to flee this nightmare in which people, thousands of them, were staring at him, Peter Pillsbury. Not with the swift approving appraisal, not with rapt admiration, nor even envy, but with deep, essential disgust, utter revulsion. "It's me, it's Geoffrey," Peter heard beside him, Geoffrey screaming to someone in the crowd. "Remember you told me I had the hottest ass in the world? Remember?" And to Peter's horror, he watched Geoffrey rip his hands from his nose and wiggle his impossibly tight shorts down to his knees. Peter gagged as he saw a vast quivering of cellulite exposed to the crowd. Some in the crowd looked away. Others groaned. Peter drove his own hands backward and felt with unbelieving fingers a similarly jiggly hugeness where only moments ago his own sculpted buttocks had been. Peter drove off the float, Peter dove off the float, landed on 3 spectators, knocking them down. He picked himself up. An older queen next to Peter stared, struck a pose, and then sniveled. "You're drunk, honey!" "Fuck you," he said, or thought he said, but the voice that he heard coming from his mouth was not his own rich bass voice, but a high, prissy lisp instead. Peter took off in a panic. He was breathless. In less than a block away from his float, the parade seemed to be going as normal, a feisty crowd and thumping dance music obliterating the nightmare silence that he had just escaped. But something was wrong, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. There was this eerie quality to things. People's faces were a blur, and they were laughing. They were laughing at him. Peter Pillsbury. He pushed his way down the street away from the crowd. Words that had never been directed at him came hurtling at him like stones. "Hey, beautify America! Put your clothes on!" he heard from one group hastily making their way through the parade. "It's mirth and girth, and I do mean girth," someone else cat-called from a balcony. And titlers of laughter rained down home. He must get home. But amidst his desperation, a seed of anger was taking root. He found moving around the street incredibly difficult, and as he guessed, he now weighed 250 pounds, and somehow most of this was fat. He could not awaken at home, or he would awaken at home. Perhaps some jealous queen had slipped something into his latte this morning. Home! He had to stop halfway up the stairs to snatch a breath. He was shaking with rage, fumbling in his slouch socks for the key. He wondered whose elephant legs these were, drooping with fat. For the first time, and as long as he could remember, there was no flashes announcing messages on his answering machine, but he didn't care. The full-length mirror in the bathroom, the mirror! He flicked on the switch outside the hall. The air was still moist from his shower, which seemed like a lifetime ago. The mirror inside the bathroom, he knew, could not lie. He had to stop again outside the door, but this time his breathlessness was due to anxiety. What would he see? Who was he now? An absurd, high sob escaped from his throat. He stepped inside. He closed his eyes and felt the middle of the room, the scent of evening primrose oil still lingering in the air. He had become aware of some vague, vast regret, a prodigal wasting of time and energy and life. He found that he was sweating, feeling his hand away, his bumpy, plump hands. He placed himself before the mirror. He opened his eyes, and staring back at him was not the face of himself, but a face of himself 250 pounds worth, riddled with boils. He pressed his eyes shut. He opened them again. No change. Peter winked, raised his fleshy hands to his face, pulled at his heavy chins. No change. He could have been his downstairs neighbor, Ken, Peter thought. But it was Peter's face now, uniquely his own. He dropped to the bathroom floor on all fours, nauseated. His rage blew up inside him, something foul and all-encompassing. He raised his head. His eyebrows narrowed, and he actually growled as he remembered the strange dream. The woman. He got up and marched into the bedroom, the light of battle in his eyes. He kicked the pieces of the busted cheval mirror out of his way without a thought. He planted himself in front of the corner where the light had first gathered, his chest heaving with rage. "What have you done to me?" he screamed, almost alarmed at the power of the voice coming out of his mouth. "Who are you? What did you do?" Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Turning, he saw himself in a mirror. He closed his eyes, and then he roared like there was something inside of him writhing with death's agony. He fell upon the floor in all fours again, trying to control his breathing. His eyes remaining closed, he remained there for some time. He became aware that something inexplicable, otherworldly even, had happened to him. Something that could never be explained in this world, yet somehow this had all kind of strange inevitability about it, some logic even, as he could not penetrate it. Oddly, he felt this face, this body, belonged to him in a way that his previous body had not. How could this be that he did not know? But nevertheless, he knew this to be true. He remained on the floor. The sun slanted into the silent apartment. It shifted slowly as shafts of light moved from room to room, illuminating various objects in the apartment, objects which Peter now felt a strange and vast disassociation from. Then the light began to fade. "Therefore, we bring you a gift." He recalled these words from before his dream. If dream it was, he closed his eyes and shook his head. Finally, he got up with an effort. He fumbled into the living room toward the large bay window, one panel of which was open. Choppy sounds of celebration filtered in from several blocks away, and then they were gone. The horizon was a clear rose. He kept his eyes upon it, but was seeing something else. He sat down again on the floor, his head full of thoughts. The Gay Twilight Zone. So that was Peter Pillsbury's Pride Parade by J.G. Hayes from This Thing Called Courage, the first randomly drawn book that I got out of my delivery today from Read With Pride. readingwithpride.com. If you live in Lexington, Versailles, Frankfurt, you have, I think, 7 days from today, maybe 6, in order to order queer novels, queer books, queer children's books, queer poetry books, queer academia books, books about queers that are not by queers, comics, graphic novels. Did I say that already? Anyway, readingwithpride.com. I got my cash today. I'm going to read one more story. One more. But I don't know what just yet. So, if there's anybody on here and they want to reply, I don't know if I can see you. I don't see any comments. All I see is like wave. I don't know if anybody said anything. This new setup's got me effed up. I've got Annie Prowls, Annie Prowls, Wyoming Stories. Ooh, what's this one come with? Is there like a gift in here? What is this? Oh, there's a bookmark in here. And the name of that story is People in Hell Just Want a Drink of Water. That might be a choice. Let's see. Ooh, but you know what I need before anything else? To wet my whistle. That's right. PBR and all my good times. And my bad ones. And my alone ones. And my naughty ones. So, if anybody was there through the entire thing, what did anybody think about the sexy man turning into a group of sexy men at the Pride Parade? Turning into a group of boil-covered fatties, as they said, with their mouths. Ooh, I can't read this one, but I'm so excited about it. Queer Cowboys and Other Erotic Male Friendships of the 19th Century American Literature. Ooh, David Levitt. Collected Stories. I want to pick something short. Not because I don't enjoy this, but because the last one was longer than I thought, but it was really good. So let's see here. If you don't know, I was delivering gloved, masked, plastic wrapped, sanitized, no contact delivery today for Lexington as a Kentucky Fried Sister for Read with Pride. I'm going to read to you the shortest story that I come across in one of these short story books. Each one of the packages came with COVID-19 information about how to handle your packages. Ooh, that's too real. I'll read that one to myself and then pick something good for you. So what have y'all been reading? Did anybody on here buy anything from the Read with Pride sale? Did anybody on here know about the Read with Pride sale? readingwithpride.com. Let's see, I'm going to pull you closer to me for a moment. Boop, 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 boop. Oh, Lucy Kitty was listening. Yay! And thank you, Jen, for your donation. Because we cannot have public events like we have been having, I did ask for donations on this particular reading. It is through your donations, usually as you participate in some event that we are doing, or some event that we are co-hosting or that we are attending with our friends through one of the other organizations, like the Imperial Court. This is a skinny book. Maybe it's got short stories. Carson McCullers, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. Well, that sounds just uplifting. Oh, never mind. The first story in that one is 73 pages long. How do you have a book this short and one story that is 173 pages long? Let's see. The Jockey is only 10 pages long. So we will hear